Welcome back. Conservative Christians flocked to D.C. this weekend for the Faith and Freedom Coalition's annual conference, featuring a speech from former President Donald Trump. Our next guest, Republican Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma, took time after his own speech to sit down with us. Here's our conversation. Senator, we're here at the Faith and Freedom gathering, and it's a moment to reflect on basically the relationship between church and politics. And in our lives, in our lifetimes, we've watched the relationship shift. 30 or 40 years ago, it was about getting Christians to be engaged in politics, calling people in the church into the political arena. But in hindsight, is it also true that politics has affected the church and that the streams have shifted?
Yeah, it really has. More people in church are talking about politics in the hallway on it, and quite frankly, that becomes an interruption to what church is really all about in the gathering. My faith affects every part of my life. My faith is not something I just do on a weekend. Things you do on a weekend is called a hobby. My faith is not just a Sunday thing. It's just who I am. It's how I live. So really there's a calling now to say, for people of faith, to engage just in your community and your family, to be able to affect the people that are around you, but also not be afraid to also speak out on national issues as well. It's not so much about taking over, and I always hear some folks in the media talking about Christian nationalism and everything else. I really don't hear that. I really don't see that. What I see is people of faith saying, I'm a part of a republic. My voice counts as much as every other voice does. But people of faith often will just sit back and go, well, I'm involved in my church, I'm involved in my community, I'm not going to get involved in those things out there. They're dirty politic and everything else. So right now I see more and more people of faith stepping up and saying, if things are going to change, I've got to actually step up and do something about it.
But how does that occur without the other side, without the flow back coming in? Because this is a problem that's divided tons of churches and has been. And you went to seminary, you were in ministry for a long time. What do you do about the other flow?
Yeah, that's a significant issue to me. I tell pastors all the time, if I'm a Republican, I'm unashamedly conservative on that. I tell pastors all the time that are conservative that would say to me, the way that I preach and the way that I actually talk about issues, Democrats wouldn't be comfortable in my church. Yeah. And I'll smile at them and say, well, that's terrible, because that means half the city is not welcome to be able to hear about the love of Jesus in your church. We should speak out boldly about issues that are faith-related issues, and there are a lot of biblical issues that are out there. The issue of life and the value of people and all those things, those are biblical issues, but we speak out in such a clear way that also presents to every person, everyone's welcome here. If at some moment the church becomes a political operation, it's temporary, it's passing. The church is larger and broader than just a political operation.
You said life, and so which leads me to, I want you to disambiguate something for me. Sure. Southern Baptist Convention recently condemned in vitro fertilization and said that this was a problem. But I also hear Republicans and conservatives say we have no interest in doing anything to limit or restrict people doing IVF, and we talked to Ralph Reed about that last week. What's going on? How should we understand this?
So the IVF thing from Southern Baptist was actually not a total ban, don't do it, don't ever. It was a, hey, that's a last resort, and there's some issues that are there. What are you doing with all those embryos that are there? So there was a challenge also to Southern Baptist to say, it's called a snowflake adoption. It's a real term to say this was a child that was abandoned, that's frozen there as an embryo. There are families that are literally saying, I can't have a child, I'm going to take one of those that would never be adopted on that and actually have that child. And so the calling that Southern Baptists were really putting out was to say, hey, let's be wise about this, because at times IVF is done with a lot of embryos that are developed and then just thrown away. Their statement was there's lots of different ways to deal with fertility issues. Let's deal with a lot of fertility, and if you end up to that, be wise in how it's done.
There's competing legislation in the Senate on this issue that's come around. You have one bill that talks about encouraging people to have, basically making it easier for people to have kids, that you want to do. There's an exemption in there that says that doctors can't be compelled to do IVF, right?
Right.
But there's also legislation that would protect IVF, that its proponents say we're going to keep it. But Republicans haven't, by and large, gotten behind that. What's the difference?
So it's interesting because IVF is protected everywhere in the country. And people will say, well, what about Alabama for that 2-week time period? And I always smile and go, it was a 2-week time period where it went from the Supreme Court, and immediately their legislature and their governor immediately said, we're going to correct all this. It's legal everywhere in the country. No one's threatening it anywhere in the country, and this has become a divisive issue politically.
Yeah.
Democrats right now are saying that Republicans are against contraceptives, they're against IVF. None of those things are true, and none of those things are actually being challenged. What they're putting into some of this legislation are little poison pills in the legislation. So they can say, hey, you're opposed to contraceptives because we had a contraceptive bill and you vote against it. Well, I did vote against it because they also put into it a challenge to what's called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. For the first time in Congress's history, we would say your faith doesn't matter. If you're a healthcare provider, whatever it may be, insurance company, your faith no longer counts on that. Well, we've never done that. They also put in a piece saying that if a state cannot ban sterilizations or sex change operations for 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds. We're like, time out. There's a lot of states that have said you can do sex change operations when you're an adult, but not as a minor. And so those little things that were tucked into a contraceptive bill, no one talked about. They just said Republicans are against contraceptives, and they would just ignore all the other aspects of it that were built in the bill that obviously Republicans are saying that's a bridge too far. We're not opposed to contraceptives. We're not opposed to IVF. We are opposed to those areas you tucked in.
Senator, are you suggesting that there is legislation that is put forward in the United States Congress that is not intended to govern but is for political messaging? I don't know. You have spent more time and more effort thinking about immigration and working on immigration. And the question basically, and you've paid a significant price, right? You got censured by your home state's Republican Party. You have been to the fair and you have seen the elephant on this issue. I look at a situation where we have Democrats have something that is popular in the United States, which is a pathway to citizenship for people who have been here for a long time illegally but haven't committed other crimes. Republicans have something that's very popular, which is strict enforcement, right? And we've seen 1 billion surveys over 30 years that show consistently that what Americans want is strict enforcement of the law combined with a pathway to citizenship. I think I know why, but why can't people have what they want? Why do these two things have to remain silent?
Yeah, it's become so noisy, quite frankly, politically on that. As you recall, when President Trump was president, he brought a bill like that out from the White House that dealt with DACA and also dealt with border security. That failed to be able to get 60 votes in the Senate. It's a controversial issue because there's so many people in Washington, D.C. and around the country that they get email blasts, they get information that literally pushes out to them, don't allow your people to be able to vote for this because it has this in it. Yeah. And it creates so much noise, and there's so many outside groups that they're built around not getting things done. It's the old consulting joke. If you can't solve a problem, there's good money to be made prolonging it. And that's where we are in this cycle at this point. But it's different this time because we have 10 million people that have illegally crossed in the last 3.5 years. That's more than the previous 12 years combined. We had 2 weeks ago, we had 8 ISIS-affiliated individuals that were picked up in Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and New York that had been in for a year at this point doing plotting and planning because they illegally came across the border. We've got 12-year-olds killed in Houston. We've got a mom of 5 that's murdered in Maryland that was, by the way, arrested in my state that had committed crimes in El Salvador, crimes in California, crimes in Maryland, and then was coming to Tulsa. People feel this differently, and what I really hear from people is make it stop. And what I was trying to do earlier this year is I wasn't getting everything I wanted, but I was trying to be able to stop the next 2 million people that were coming in the rest of this year. We didn't pass it. We're going to have another 2 million people because Biden's been unwilling to actually do the enforcement that President Trump did or President Obama did. I mean, President Obama had 500,000 people a year illegally crossing.
Called him the deporter-in-chief.
I know, he's the exact same laws. He had 500,000. President Biden has 2.5 million a year. I mean, it's a huge difference. So for me, it's we need the administration to be able to do their job, but Congress also needs to close the gap on that last 500,000. That's changing the asylum laws. It's changing this endless appeals process that's there. That's a job of Congress that we need to do.
So speaking of Congress doing its job, you're not going to take anything for granted, but right now the conditions look very favorable for the Republicans this November. Right, the situation looks good. Democrats have already basically ceded West Virginia, and the map is looking very good for Republicans. But there's a change ahead, which is Mitch McConnell, the guy who has been the sort of the wizard of the Senate, legislative wizard, of procedural wizard, is stepping down. He's going to step down after November. First, I know you're not going to tell me, but I have to ask, do you have a horse for the next leader of the Republican conference in the Senate?
I don't yet, but you're right. Mitch McConnell's the longest serving leader of any party in the Senate, in the history of the Senate. He's been there a very long time. It's, as Lamar Alexander used to say, it's hard to get to the Senate, it's hard to stay in the Senate. You might as well do something while you're there. And McConnell has been this long leader that's very hard to be able to be a leader that long, but he's been very effective at what he's doing.
So if John Thune and John Cornyn are waiting in the hallway out here with roses for you, and Rick Scott are waiting in the hallway with roses for you. Last question. Whoever the Senate leader is for Republicans, if Donald Trump does win the presidency, they're going to face extraordinary pressure to abandon the filibuster and the 60-vote threshold. You've recently gotten kicked in the teeth by the 60-vote threshold and how hard it is to pass stuff through the Senate. Should the Senate keep the filibuster?
100% we should keep the filibuster, regardless. It is short-sighted to be able to say when you win the majority that you immediately kick the filibuster out and then just do whatever you want, because then the same thing will happen again. Democrats will win all three and they'll do it. Then we have churn. The stability of the law is important for us in America, and the Senate is the one place in this uniquely American institution of the filibuster. It is the one place in all of our government where both sides have to be heard. That is important for us as Americans, and we feel it in the few times that there's been a supermajority for Democrats, like during the Obamacare and the Dodd-Frank debates. America really had a huge churn during that time because they felt like the minority of opinions felt like they're not being heard. Because in the Senate, the minority always has to be heard. That's the spot where grown-ups have to be grown-ups, and to sit down and to say, we disagree on this, but let's sit down and actually solve this. That's what families have to do all the time. We as a nation, our family kitchen table is the United States Senate. It is the most frustrating place in the entire country to serve, because even when you're in the majority, you can't do what you want. You still have to sit down with people you disagree with and work it out.
All right, if you were from Tahlequah, you'd know him already, but if you don't, there he is, James Lankford, Senator from Oklahoma.